All right, y'all. This is Organized Voices, June 21st, 2020. Father's Day. Happy Father's Day to both of your fathers. My father, special shout outs to my dad in San Francisco. Special shout out to your fathers in your respective cities. Today we're going to be covering incarceration, mass incarceration, the effect that has on children's outcomes, our fathers that are in the struggle in this movement. I just want to remind our audience that Organized Voices was created to inform our community of national and local social justice issues. We want to bring light and a deeper assessment of those issues that mainstream broadcast media fail to deliver. And we hope to provide balance, reasoned perspectives, and organize all of our voices so that we can try to figure out some solutions in this constant fight for social justice. Today we have special guest Eric Harris, a policy advocate. We have Tifanei Ressl-Moyer, civil rights attorney, and both of them will be giving us updates on our movement. And we want to do a special tribute for fathers all across our nation and beyond, but especially in the movement. So thank you for all those joining us right now. Special shout out to Chuck B for that new single, State of the Union, Shut the Fuck Up. Very appropriate timing for a song like that to get us, fired up for this movement. We gotta keep fighting. But let me just start with my guest here. 1 second. All right, so let's get to it. Start with Eric and Tifanei. Want to do some introductions. Eric, do you want to start with your role in the movement and kind of the work that you do without having to announce your organization?
Yes, thank you so much, Liz, for having me. It's a pleasure to be on here, both with you and Tifanei. I'd like to first give a shout out to my dad. I know that you gave shout outs to fathers, and I wanted to first say Happy Father's Day to my dad and both of my grandfathers who have passed away over the last several years, but they're always in my heart and in my spirit as I continue the fight for justice and continue this in this movement. So I'm a statewide policy advocate. I've been one now for the last several years. I am a legislative advocate, a lobbyist, but I am a lobbyist for civil rights groups. I've been a lobbyist for the NAACP of the state of California, as well as disability organizations in the state of California. Before that, I worked for several members, legislative members and city council members at the local and national level, both in Sacramento, Northern California, and in Washington, D.C. It's a real pleasure to do this work. It's sometimes thankless, but it's so important, and it's so important that a voice is given to the voiceless, as we always say. So I'm really, really proud to do the work that I do, and I look forward to continuing to do the work that we have to do as a collective and that I have to do as an individual. As unfortunate as it might be sometimes that we still have to do this work, it's necessary, and it's something that fills your heart when you are able to continue to do what's right. So I'm glad to be on here. Thank you so much.
So much, Eric. It's great to have you join us. I also want to give a quick shout out to your dad as well. He's also a definite warrior in this movement. We're very lucky to have him fight with us. It's an honor to fight alongside both of you and also your father. And Tifanei, I've yet to meet your dad, so one day I hope to change that. I'm sure he's great, judging by what I know about you. But special shout outs to Eric's dad, Mark Harris, as well, who we hope to have in our future shows. Tifanei, go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us about your involvement with the movement.
Yeah, absolutely. How do I follow up with that with Eric? That was pretty dope.
You're also a superstar. So we're so proud to have you.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me, Liz. I appreciate it. So I'm a civil rights attorney. I currently work for Lawyers Committee for the Civil Rights of, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights in the San Francisco Bay Area. And right now we're doing just a whole host of things, looking at how we can combat the different ways that law enforcement in the state criminalize Black and brown people, or try to control bodies of Black and brown people, and that manifests in a lot of different ways. Currently, it's really how can we provide support to protesters and organizers who are on the ground, whether or not that means providing direct representation or building impact cases or impact or organizing to be able to protect folks. In the past, I have worked as a plaintiff's attorney on behalf of folks who are incarcerated,
Right.
trying to ensure that they have access to medical care, mental health care, make sure they have access to what they have a constitutional right to receive when they're incarcerated. A lot of times that was inside of jails or juvenile halls, and occasionally that was inside state hospitals, because a lot of people are there, most people are there involuntarily. It's another form of incarceration. And so a lot of my experience comes from litigating those types of cases.
And I just want to quickly point out that Tifanei has been absolutely involved in the front lines with getting demand letters out and arranging negotiations to get our brothers and sisters incarcerated out. We've been very successful in our past year's efforts. Decarcerate Sacramento is something that she's heavily involved in. We've had several victories, you know, steps in the right direction. Of course, we still have a lot of work to do, but I just want to personally thank you on behalf of the streets, the activist community, and all of those affected by the mass incarceration in our country, and especially our local areas, especially during the times of COVID, where it's literally a death sentence if we don't get them out. It's a matter of life or death right now. So thank you for your important work in all of this. So I just want to jump into the theme of the day. I want to focus on something that I don't feel is highlighted enough in the media and in our communities, the effect of these policies and the injustices that our community is facing to fathers, but of course the families impacted by the fact that our fathers are you know, paying the ultimate price by these bad policies that are geared for you know, dehumanizing our people so that it's easier to criminalize and it's easier to oppress and easier to control and run their agendas at the cost of our families, and how that impacts our community as a whole. Do either one of you want to speak to the connection between the disparity in our communities with the criminal justice system and the mass incarceration specifically?
Yeah, I can share, you know, something that we're working on right now that I think highlights this in a way that, quite frankly, I hadn't really been expecting it. It's something that kind of lays underneath what's covered in the press, underneath what most folks want to put all of their resources and effort into fighting. And that's right now we're trying to fight these curfew violations that folks have received for protesting. So one of the ways that the city tried to suppress speech was to introduce a curfew so that everybody needs to go home by 8 p.m. at night. And folks who were aware, most people were not aware of the curfew at all, received citations for being out beyond that. And what happens with those citations is that they end up becoming what's called a low-level offense or a minor infraction, but it comes with price tags up of $500, right? And if you miss a court date, or if you miss you know, any of the things that are associated with these types of citations, it can go much higher than that. And so most families, you know, studies have shown, cannot pay more than $400 in an emergency bill, right? And so when the city enacts this thing to suppress speech, it comes with a huge price tag that impacts fathers and families, because what happens when that individual can't pay and what's at risk for them is incarceration is their family does everything they can to be able to get them out of that situation. So the family takes on that debt.
Right. Eric, do you want to speak to the fact that how the fiscal impact of bringing these charges to people that are arrested trying to exercise their First Amendment rights to stand up for Black lives, stand up for civil rights, how that may affect us even beyond the fiscal impact, how that translates to our families?
Yeah, to kind of follow up with what Tiffany was just saying, it's an ongoing cycle. It's a never-ending cycle. So, as she said, you start off with a low-level offense, and then you're not able to pay a fine, and then it leads to other problems. As she said, the family puts all of their energy and all of their resources into solving this one issue, and then you have another issue that comes that just naturally occurs, and it just piles on top of each other. And we've seen it, and it impacts Black fathers especially, and that impact and that in itself has an impact on Black boys and Black girls, not having a father around, or having a father who's constantly dealing with the stress that comes with dealing with law enforcement on an everyday basis, or dealing with some of these fines on an everyday basis. So it's just an ongoing cycle that other communities just do not have to deal with. You don't go when you're in Folsom, or when you're in Roseville, or when you're in Curtis Park. People don't deal with these kinds of issues on an everyday constant basis. So when you're dealing with these on an everyday constant basis, it impacts not only families, children, communities, but it's just an ongoing cycle. And what we've seen at organizations that I've been around, especially disability organizations, and the NAACP, that the statistics bear out that Black and brown boys especially, but Black and brown children are often suspended. They're often diagnosed with mental illness, etc. And it just constantly piles up on top of one another, and it continues to feed into the ongoing cycle that we were discussing earlier.
Right, so let me add to that. So according to Economic Policy Institute, published in December 15 of 2016, which is 4 years ago, and I'm not sure if maybe you can speak to whether this has improved, as many as 1 in 10 African-American students has an incarcerated parent. 1 in 4 has a parent who is or has been incarcerated. 1 in 3 Americans in general have a criminal record of some kind. And this report is actually explaining how this type of statistic really impacts our students from many disciplines, showing children's performances in schools, how they do in certain demographics of criminal justice, health, sociology, their overall physical health. It's been declared a public health crisis by the Harvard Medical Review, that when a father is shot or incarcerated, it's not just that person that's impacted, but the families and the community surrounding it, have a lasting, reverberating, impact, and how this affects their likelihood of cancer, death, heart disease, all kinds of things that manifest into physical illnesses. So you can imagine how with this, combined with the pandemic right now, how this might be worse since this report has been published. So what are your thoughts on the fact that if this has an impact on our education, the spending that we have towards incarceration versus investments into education? Do either of you want to comment on the funding that goes towards education versus the mass incarceration problem?
Yeah, I think the study that you cited is really important, and just this, the entire nation right now is putting out a call for defunding the police.
Right.
That people keep pointing out is, defunding the police sounds really scary to people, but when you compare to the fact that education has been defunded throughout decades, it actually is not really that radical of an idea, and that what it really shows is that our budget speaks to our values. And so if we can put more money into schools and providing folks what they need as far as education and healthcare services in the schools, right, and mental health services in those schools, then we really can be able to provide, kids with a future that doesn't have incarceration involved in it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, to follow up with that, it's funny because I've known Tiffany for a little over a year now, and And she was somebody who came to me pretty early on and said, and was talking about defunding police and was talking about the abolition of police. And I consider myself a pretty radical person. I consider myself somebody who's radical for justice, radical for the right thing. And when I first heard her say it hit me a certain way, like, wait, is that something that we can really do? And the more I talked to her, the more I spent time with her, the more I did my own kind of follow-ups and research and just understanding of the entire criminal justice system, the entire police system as we know, starting off with slave catching and eventually leading, from slave catching through Jim Crow, and through the quote unquote crime on drugs, and war on drugs. We've seen these things just continue and continue, and there's always another excuse. There's always another reason to give more money to law enforcement. And I got to see this up close and personal when I worked in City Hall. As Tiffany said, it shows where your true values are. It shows where your true priorities are as a city, as a government, as a country. When you put your money, your resources behind putting more law enforcement in communities, particularly communities of color, particularly when we're talking about Sacramento or California, we're talking about Del Paso Heights, we're talking about Meadowview, Valley High, we're talking about Oak Park, we're talking on a statewide level of East Oakland, East Palo Alto, South Central Los Angeles, Compton, East Long Beach, etc. And we see it constantly. We don't, and when we talk about communities and what benefits communities, whenever we discuss white communities or more affluent communities, we talk about libraries or grocery stores or mental health treatment or other forms of positive reinforcement, economic development, business and working coaches, job coaches. But when we talk about the communities that we're discussing, when we talk about Black and Brown communities, it's often city's first choice is always, let's put more law enforcement there. Let's load up on resources to police and fire. We've seen it in the Sacramento community, especially over the last several years with Measure U money. A lot of people were really positive about Measure U money when it came to additional resources for the community. That wasn't explicitly stated what the community meant, and there were several advocates saying that this is a yellow or red flag. Everybody, we need to be careful when we give additional resources to the city to be able to spend on what they deem priorities. And as we're seeing now in the city of Sacramento, and we've seen it across the country for generations, that when cities and states have the resources and additional resources, they almost always give it to law enforcement to double and triple down on militarizing our communities. And it's really, really disheartening. It's frustrating, but that's why we're all fighting these fights, because we've seen the negative impacts in our communities, and we've seen police chiefs throughout the country, including in Sacramento, say that they are not equipped to handle some of the calls that they get, especially dealing with mental health crisis situations, addiction situations, and others. And they have said that it would probably be better for other people who are experts in these spaces to handle these situations. And as I know we would all say, we need to go even a step beyond that. That is a step, but then we also need to reinvest in our communities by giving more resources to the communities that need it the most, and really lift up the communities by making them healthier, by giving money to schools, by giving money to giving more grocery stores, positive eating, getting rid of these food deserts, getting rid of these dilapidated parts of these communities that really could be transformed in a positive way, while still keeping the input of the community and the people who are there in the most positive way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
what you said, something was really important, Eric, and that's like the cycle that it creates, you know, and start bringing up school, I think is really important to highlight that cycle, because the more interaction that young people have with law enforcement, the more likely that the trajectory of their life is going to land them in some way criminalized, some way within the justice system. And so the ironic and also horrifying part about all money always going to law enforcement is that by introducing law enforcement at all in the beginning is going to create the need for law enforcement in the future, because they are creating the problem that they're, you know, saying or purporting that they are trying to fix, essentially.
Right. So like all problems, it's very important to identify what's causing those problems. And of course, there's many layers to this, and I know that this goes very deep. But what are some, you know, very glaring, you know, reasons that, or actually barriers that prevent us from being able to have an easier time in fighting this cycle to break and then to reestablish our priorities to go towards education? What do you think some of those barriers might be in having our policies, you know, recognize that education is where we should be investing our funds rather than incarceration?
Well, I think the first thing that everybody needs to recognize is that these systems are broken. These systems are not working for the people who need them the most.
Right.
And of course, I mean, we've all heard it and we all understand that the systems are working the way that they were designed to work, right? But for the people that need these systems, for particularly low-income Black and Brown communities who really depend on the education, the public education system, social services, good, you know, good public service, etc. These systems have never worked for our communities. And the only way, as we've discussed, the only way to really fix them is to completely tear them down and rebuild them back up in positive ways that reinforce the priorities that we all acknowledge need to be acknowledged when it comes to low income, in particular, Black and Brown communities, immigrant communities, et cetera, especially in a state like California, when up until COVID, we had resources on top of resources, money on top of money flowing in through all types of, through taxes, et cetera, where we were able to distribute those resources in places that the state determined to be priorities. And moving forward, that can still be the case. But at first, I mean all the leaders throughout the state, from the top down, need to recognize that this system is broken and that it needs to be rebuilt with the right type of leadership and with the right type of priorities in mind moving forward. Then we'll be able to say, instead of suspending this boy or this girl or sending them off to the criminal justice system, let's find other ways to reinforce their education and really lift this child up in a positive way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that starts with how we even treat our students, right? There's a lot of criminalization in the education system itself. Expulsions that are happening to those of color, especially Black kids in school systems, is an issue of its own. There's a whole movement on that, on how schools are more likely to discipline, punish, suspend, and expel students of color at a much higher rate than those that are white, and the impact that that has on the students that are already, you know, facing difficulties and challenges based on the demographics or, you know, the redlining in our communities and in our neighborhoods. And so, and then the access to education, the unequal access, the types of education, and ultimately the pipeline to what type of, you know, career pathways that they have presented as opportunities for these students. All ties into this problem of mass incarceration in our society. And so, you know, I'm hearing you say that maybe it requires leadership change as part of a solution. What are some other things that we can change to improve upon or really change our system, like you said, from the ground up? Tiffany, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, you know, I think something that we often, just as humans, especially in this day and age, overlook is one of the solutions is to slow down and really think about what's effective. Really think about what it is that we need. You're reminding me of a report, an investigative report that the NBC in the Bay Area did. And they just looked at the data from the Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Education, and it showed that young Black kids were 3 times as likely than white kids to be arrested at school and taken out. And also that kids with disabilities were 3 times as likely to be taken out of school.
Yeah.
And then it looked at if you were a Black kid with disabilities, it was 16 times, excuse me.
Wow.
So that intersection made made children specifically targeted and vulnerable. And you know, there's a lot of things you can draw from that data, but one thing is really clear to me from that, which is that if you haven't, as a school, the leadership in the school identify the specific needs that Black students have, the specific needs that students with disabilities have, and the specific needs that Black students with disabilities have, then you're responding with the only thing that you've set in place to deal with social issues, which is law enforcement. And if you had taken just a little bit more time to think about what young Black kids need, what young students with disabilities, what young people at that intersection need, you would be able to come up with solutions that address those issues as opposed to disposing of them, which is really what happens.
And honestly, I didn't even realize until recently how many police officers we have present in schools. Do you want to speak to what drives that reasoning as to why there's even a police presence in schools? I mean, I understand we have mass shootings, but I just don't understand how that prevents them, because we still have a lot of mass shootings happening. Every time, you know, we turn around, there's another story about some shootings. We had that going on until COVID hit. And so I'm not really sure what the reasoning is, justifications for having police at the schools and the funding that, you know, requires, rather than the books, the very educational tools that the students need to succeed. You know, it's breeding a culture of law and order, even at the educational level where students are dealing with this. Yeah. Do you want to comment on the culture that's perpetuated by that?
Well, you know, I was just going to be frank and admit that I don't actually know the history of how policing was introduced into schools.
Yeah, there's a lot of unknown information on some of the reasonings, because they're not outright, you know, going beyond the statement that it's for the good of public safety. That's like a tagline that I hear over and over again. You know, public safety is this general idea, right? But how does that translate into how that overcomes the impacts, the negative impacts that it, you know, renders in other areas? I'm starting to really lose the true meaning of what public safety really means, because we're still looking at a huge number of people that are suffering from police violence specifically. And so I just don't see how more police presence in schools, you know, really achieves the outcome that I think they're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think it's the question that a lot of people are asking themselves right now, which is, what is public safety? Because you're defining it as law enforcement, and I don't feel safe around law enforcement. And I think, you know, a lot of something that was coming to mind about schools for me was that a lot of teachers will say that they don't feel safe, right, with certain students in their classroom, or there's other students don't feel safe. And so that's why law enforcement is justified in these situations.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the reality is that we define safety, or we have come to define safety as this need for retribution, or this need for punishment, right? Which we know doesn't heal anything. You know, you can see somebody who's done harm to you also endure harm themselves. And for most of us, it doesn't make us feel better. It doesn't make us feel more whole. You know, it's just a really kind of twisted way to look at how to deal with for what we need to actually feel safe and healthy in our environments and accepted in our environments, and especially twisted when we introduce it to our children's environments.
Right. I have a quick question. This is more, this is not so much policy based, but I am just curious to hear, growing up and kind of going back to what we learned from our fathers, what are some conversations you guys might have had, either of you might have had about law enforcement or police officers with your father? I've had some, interesting conversations about my father, but I just don't think that he was even able to prepare me for what we're dealing with right now. And I just wanted to kind of gauge, what our father's takes were on police, law enforcement as a whole, and how they taught us as we were growing up. Do you have any memories or thoughts you might want to share about conversations you've had with your fathers about law enforcement?
It's interesting. My dad gave me the same, discussion, the same talk that many Black boys, especially, but Black children hear growing up. And, it stuck with me. I think he probably gave me the conversation really early on as a child, like as a young child, and then again, kind of reinforcing it throughout middle school, high school, and especially when I was able to start driving. But the one that the kind of comment that sticks out to me the most was actually made by my mother when I was really young. She said that whatever happens, make sure you get home. And that really stuck with me because it was like, I, as a young person, you get angry, you figure out ways to kind of get around things. You wanna fight systems. You want to fight against in situations where you feel like you've been treated wrong. But at the end of the day, my mother always said the only way that we can truly fight this and truly heal is if you get home safely. If you don't get home safely, there's nothing, there's nothing we can do. So that, really stuck with me and still sticks with me to this day. As Tifanei said, I also am very, very uncomfortable around law enforcement. And
may I ask really quickly, at what age did those conversations start taking place? Because those are some real mature, conversations to have. And I wonder, at what age do we start having those conversations? And certainly we know we don't have those conversations in communities or, families that aren't of color.
They probably actually started happening vaguely when I was in elementary school. I went to private schools in Sacramento and spent a lot of time with kids who were not always Black. Like sometimes I'd hang out with a lot of Black friends. Sometimes I'd hang out with white friends, Asian friends, Latinx friends. And there were situations where I'd be hanging out with particularly my white friends, and they would get caught up in stuff. They would try different things and I would be around them. So I would end up getting caught up in different things too. And, my parents, of course, would find out about it, and that was, kind of the first couple of times where my dad would sit me down and say, you can't do some of the things that they do. You can't get in trouble, and you can't do some of the things that they do. You can't be associated with some of the things that they're doing, because if you get in trouble, it's going to come down 3, 4, 5 times as hard on you. And that's kind of when the discussion started. As both of you guys know, my dad's a civil rights attorney, has been involved in civil rights cases and police brutality cases for decades. So before I was born, so he already knew, and especially, and also growing up in Los Angeles with the Watts riots in '65 and the riots in '92. So he had a certain perspective and gave me some of this knowledge at a really early age. Elementary school, I would say, is when I first started having these types of discussions.
Wow. What about you, Tifanei?
So we never had a talk like that. I actually grew up as a military brat. And we spent a lot of my adolescence in Germany, so over in Europe, in Western Europe, and policing is completely different there. And so,
which explains the difference in the culture, right? From an international perspective,
I couldn't, unless there were sirens going off because there was an emergency somewhere, you really didn't see police around.
Right.
And so the first memory that really comes up for me is I had just learned to drive and we had moved to Ohio. And I got pulled over for a rolling stop. And when they pulled me over, I dropped my driver's license. And so I had to go and grab it. And the law enforcement officer left the side of the window, and there were 5 other cop cars that came behind me, told me to get out of the vehicle. And my dad had driven by when that happened. And so he parked right in front of me and got, what's happening? This is my daughter. And every one of those officers drew a gun on him.
Wow.
And it was just terrifying and confusing, this day I still don't really have an explanation for why they thought, not that an explanation would do justice for the level of trauma that inflicted, but even absent these conversations, and even with different experiences being in Europe for some point, like there's sometimes the words don't need to be spoken, and it's that we're not safe here and we have to protect each other, and like you said, Eric, get home safely.
Yeah, and I just want to quickly announce that Kellan Patterson has just joined us. He's also a criminal defense / civil rights attorney. He's a colleague from law school, and he's joining us for this conversation as well. Kellan, welcome to the discussion. We just asked, at what age did your father, or your parents have brought up the conversation of law enforcement, what that conversation was like, and at what age did you first start having those talks?
Let's see. Oh man. To be honest with you, I didn't really have those conversations with my father until high school. But directly about how to deal with law enforcement. Most of the time when I was, a kid, it was just obey anybody with any sense of authority over you. So that included other family members, teachers, of course, in law enforcement. But, I was raised, in the church. So we kind of had that foundation of just being raised to respect anybody with authority over you, regardless of them being police or not. But when I got older, I think it especially living in Oakland, it became apparent that run-ins with the police will be frequent, and those conversations ensued at that point specifically about how to deal with the police and to make sure that I'm not doing anything that would come off as quote unquote threatening, unquote, to be respectful, to kind of shuffle, use the word sir, not necessarily be combative, talk back and stuff like that.
Right.
So it didn't start young for me, but it definitely occurred around my teenage years.
So, the fact that all 4 of us are advocates against, police brutality, do you feel that it was a subject matter that was hard to broach as parents? Or do you feel that, it's maybe due to the fact that they want to keep you innocent and not tell you all the nitty-gritty details of, dangers that they may have? Because I want to point out the reason why I'm asking this question is when I first talked about teaching social justice to children, I had a lot of parents that, hit me up and were opposed to teaching about social justice because they felt that there was a risk that we are already putting a bias or fear into children's minds about what law enforcement represents, which may perpetuate the problem, at too early of an age. So maybe a better question would be, at what age do you think it's appropriate to have these conversations with our children, students, and what would be the right tone or approach in having this discussion with kids right now? And I know, Kellan, you're a parent, So maybe that might help to, you know, add to maybe your perspective on that.
Right. Well, it all depends on the maturity of your child, you know, to have these discussions. And there's definitely ways to bring in the conversation that is age appropriate, so you're not having them confused about how to respond to a certain situation that they may be, you know, they will have to deal with. But for me, I actually had conversations with my son, who is, you know, 8 now, but we have conversation previously, mainly because of the line of work that I do.
Yeah.
You know, civil rights litigation, I'm constantly, you know, suing police officers and, you know, jailers and all that type of stuff. So, you know, he knows what I do. And so we have conversations about that. And additionally, he's in the an after school program here in the Tacoma School District called the Roberts Family. And they hold no punches. And I love that. And they teach the kids who look like us that, you know, there is a different way of how policing occur in our communities. And so I just allow, you know, him to ask questions, really, you know, or you know, and then I just respond to him. And I haven't really had to sit down with him and be like, this is exactly what you need to know for these reasons. But I have explained to him, you know, and said, hey, you know, you want to make sure that you have, you're pretty vigilant around police, because, you know, you can't just play with certain type of, you know, toy guns and stuff in the neighborhood, just because if someone called the police on you, and you know, that can be a very dangerous and deadly situation for them. And so there's definitely conversations like that to be honest with you, you know, I have a firearm, and I don't
Yeah.
I don't make any excuses for that. I was raised and came of age in West Oakland, just a couple of blocks. My mother is from Oakland. My mother's family is from Oakland, and we live a couple of blocks from the Black Panthers party headquarters. And I just have a lot of influence from that. And so, you know, I have a firearm and all that, and I teach him basic gun safety with the use of a BB gun, and so he's aware of that. And I'm saying, hey, you know, don't you ever go look for this thing and it's locked away and everything. I'm talking about the BB gun. He has absolutely no access to the real firearm. But you know, and teach him how to use that BB gun. But I let him know. I said, hey, absolutely under no circumstances can you use this or try to use this BB gun outside of my presence, because, you know, just I did that with my cousins in Oakland and didn't realize until a lot older that I was pretty crazy and stupid. And so there's things like that that, you know, I have conversations with them about. And I know I'm kind of rambling a little bit, but I'm just want to, you know, now conclude this point of just saying, like, it really depends on the maturity of your child, I would say.
Yeah.
And if you can handle that conversation, because you don't necessarily want to just go out and, you know, if they come across police, to, you know, have this amazing amount of fear that can be, you know, paralyzing, because you want them to operate. And sometimes children, you know, they don't have the ability to, you know, operate if they feel like their life is, you know, threatened potentially. So I wanted to make sure that, you know, once he gets to that point, then I can, you know, give him more information, feed him a little bit more. But up until, you know, to now, I haven't necessarily just sat down and just spilled the tea.
Right. No, it's not rambling at all. I feel like this is an important point that we have to make, because I do feel that there is an area of deficiency in how we're educating our kids about this. There's really no right or wrong answers, but I'm seeing a lot of kids out there at protests, parents bringing kids, and I just wonder if there really is a guideline or a standard that we might want to try to work towards, you know, in making sure that our kids are informed and educated and trained but in a way that doesn't, make them necessarily have negative energy, or have like a dark bias towards society in general. And so I think it is important to have different perspectives and people weighing in, especially people of all three of your backgrounds, because you are qualified to speak on this matter. And so even without children, thank you for that perspective, Kellan. And by the way, happy Father's Day. Thank you for all you do. But yeah, either Tifanei or Eric, what are your thoughts on when would be the appropriate time to address this issue with our kids, our students in the community, and whether you feel that it is appropriate to have our kids involved in protests and demonstrations at this time?
I don't have children, but when I do spend time with kids, be it my nieces and nephews or my friends' kids, what strikes me always is how much more they are aware of and understand than we give them credit for. How easy it is for us to forget that there's much we didn't understand, but there was a lot that we understood, even though we didn't have the context to really put our own meaning to it.
Right.
I think it's probably safe to let them know, adults make mistakes. And one of the mistakes that adults have made are funding the police.
Excellent point.
And it's not that you have to be mad at society. It's not that you have to be mad or frustrated or angry with humanity. It's that you have to understand that here's a mistake that's happened and has been sustained over centuries. And as kids, you have an opportunity to imagine the world in a much different way. And, help us adults understand how we can invest in something that supports kids like you and also makes the world better for your kids and your children.
Right. What about you, Eric? Excellent point.
Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely. I want to give a shout out to the Roberts Family Development Center. That was actually my first, job. My first job in middle school was helping out at the Roberts Family Development Center. So shout out to Daryl Roberts and his team out there. They always do wonderful things for our kids, and it's positive. It's been positive for generations. So when it comes to my perspective on this, I also have children, but I recently, within it's probably about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, my younger cousins reached out to me. It was actually their mother. My aunt reached out to me first and said that one of my younger cousins was really having trouble. He was saying some things that she thought were a little concerning. He's always a very positive and energetic boy, and really very just an excited young person. And over the last couple of weeks has really been struggling, and needed some older folks that he could relate to be able to talk to. So my brother Martin and I gave him a call. We actually FaceTimed he and his brother to talk about kind of what was happening, what feelings he was having, and it's so frustrating, and that this is his first opportunity, I guess, to experience some of these things, to see some of these videos in real time, and to be able to talk to somebody about this. I know that one of the reasons he was frustrated is because he saw what happened. He was frustrated about that. He had been frustrated already about COVID and what's been happening as far as having to be at school at home. And then he lives in Oakland, so they were having protests in Oakland and curfews, and he was confused and frustrated about that. And so I think that, as both of the previous speakers have said, it depends on the young person's maturity level, their understanding. And I can say, both from my experience as a young person and now, that it is always helpful to hear it not just from my parents, but to be able to discuss it with other folks who are a little bit closer to my age. So when I was young, I was able to talk to my older cousins who might have been 7, 8, 10 years older than me, but I was able to relate to them at a certain level. They were able to explain things a little bit differently than my parents might have. And it gave me an opportunity to have some real honest conversations with them about some of these things. So I think that that kind of combination of your own child's maturity level, your ability to explain to them what is happening in a way that is honest and truthful, but still in a relatively positive way where they don't kind of, as you said earlier, view society in an only negative way, but we're able to kind of navigate the positive out of it. So both that and having some younger folks who children can relate to. I think those things can result in can bring about a positive result.
Absolutely. And I also just want to quickly share my first time. When I was 6 years old, I was living in Korea, South Korea, and my mom had told me as we were, going out to stores and walking down the street and stuff, she said, if we ever lose each other and you can't find me, do not go to any man, not even a police officer. You find an old grandma and ask for help from an old grandma, because you can't trust, anyone, not even a police officer. And we don't deal with police brutality like we, in South Korea, like we do here culturally, but they are known to be easy to bribe, so you can pay them to overlook things or turn the other way. And also my uncle was chief of police in Seoul, which is the capital of South Korea. And I remember when I was 6, my dad had got into a bar fight with some police officers that were off duty and in civilians' clothes, and they beat him up and threw him in jail. And my uncle, because he's chief, had fired those officers. And we were telling that story at the family table like it was funny. But, as I grew older, it kind of revealed to me a culture of, it's just different from here, but, there is something that's not ethical or, not by the rules that we should be abiding by in so many ways with stories like that. And then as I came here, I had my own run-ins with law enforcement. So my parents, didn't really have that talk with me so much as I experienced it myself. But I just wanted to kind of compare and contrast with how it is. I know, Tifanei, you grew up in a whole nother continent as well. So it is very important to compare and contrast so that we can get a perspective on what we're dealing with here in the United States and in California. And I can safely assume that in other states, it might be wildly varied with how it compares to California, which is a lot more diverse than other states. And so just to extend this conversation a little bit further, what do you think is the appropriate age? Do you think it's just about the same as far as talking about social justice in general, maybe not specifically law enforcement, but maybe instilling in our children just the idea of, civil rights and the idea of, equality for all and humanity instead of it being an individualistic kind of mindset? What is a good time to have that conversation with our kids? Kellan, do you want to start?
Sorry, I didn't know you were going to call me first, but
well, just because you're the parent.
An expert.
I thought Eric said he had kids too. I probably heard it wrong.
Nah.
Okay. As early as possible.
There you go.
As soon as they open their eyes, you can start reading them books about the struggle of African Americans and Black people, and I guess on the entire continent of America. Because my wife, she's Trinidadian, so they have their own particular struggle down there too in Trinidad and Tobago.
Yeah.
Right? So that's something that I introduced to my both of my sons as early as I possibly can, reading certain books, letting them know about their history, our own families, actions that, like my mom, she's the reason why her and her class of Oakland Tech is the reason why California celebrates Martin Luther King Day for the work that they did to make it a state holiday. And so telling those family stories and letting them know that, hey, Black folks have already done a lot of work to get to where we are, but we still, the baton has just been passed to us in our generation, and the baton will be passed to your generation to continue to fight. And that starts early, in my mind, as early as they can have an ear to listen, just speak truth to them.
Right. What about either of y'all? Guys agree with that? Never too early to learn about the Geneva Convention?
You know, it makes sense
Right.
to me. You know, their education in preschool, you know, starts
Right.
really. So if you're going to provide an alternative to our history, then might as well start as early as possible.
Yeah. What about you?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I mean, we learned the golden rule when we're first able to communicate, when we're first, when we first interact with other children, especially, but other people, we learn to treat others the way we want to be treated. And it's, I mean, so there, as the others have said, there is no time that's too early to learn about equality, to learn about fairness and justice, and that we all need to be treating everybody equally, and that everybody deserves that. So I don't think there is a time that's too early.
Awesome. I also wanted to ask your guys' opinion on the sweeping action right now throughout our country where they're toppling the statues of those that were oppressors, slave owners. I think personally it's exciting. Some people are like, is this really the way? But I feel like it's finally identifying and recognizing our history and the darkness that, we've kind of really founded our history and our culture on. And for our young students, our young kids to see that, do you think it's the right message to topple those statues, rename schools that were named after slave owners and oppressors? Do you think that that's a good demonstration overall in changing our culture? And do you think that it is a start or just really maybe for show? What are your thoughts on that happening throughout the country?
I say topple them all down.
Right? Down with the statue. Yeah.
As far as what's the lesson, what's the takeaway, it's just a healthy message. I think there are many methods towards the path toward Black liberation, and to put too much judgment or criticism towards one of those paths, it's not something that I'm comfortable with.
Right. I do want to point out also that the Capitol, the legislature, the Speaker of the House, Tony Atkins, along with two other legislators, made the proposal to actually, take it upon themselves to remove the statue of Columbus. I believe that's in the Capitol under the rotunda right now. So they're being proactive instead of waiting for the activists to come and take it down themselves. So maybe if, other elected officials take suit, that might be even healthier. It's always better to have a proactive actions than to have a reaction. So you want to weigh in on that, Eric or Kellan?
Yeah, it's I agree with Tiffany. Tear them all down. I think I was watching a national news network. I don't remember which one it was, but some conservative was on there asking the question, basically, we're tearing down Confederate statues now, but what comes next? Tearing down Thomas Jefferson statues and George Washington statues? And my first thought, of course, is that's cool with me. That's cool with me. When we're talking about oppressors and we're talking about slave owners and we're talking about not even and it's weird to even say this, not even just slave owners.
Right.
But I hope your listeners look up the history of Thomas Jefferson in particular and really examine kind of how he treated his slaves, if that's the best way to put it. Especially the slave women, and just the abuse and oppression that is written throughout this country's history needs to be exposed in every way, and so tearing down these statues is the first step, and then of course we should, I think, have some follow-up actions and some follow-up discussions about promoting people that really deserve to be promoted. and you know, the idea that we would have Confederate statues still up and Confederate named schools still in this country, when we all know that the Confederacy was only around for a short period of time. They were traitors and they lost. So when we look just at that part, before we even get to the oppressive nature of the Confederacy and the slave owning and them being slave owners, there is no reason at all to still have these statues up. We wouldn't go, you know, Tiffany talked about being from Germany. My mom was actually raised in Germany as well, as a military brat. And they wouldn't, you know, if they still had a bunch of Nazi, a bunch of Nazi statues and a bunch of, you know, Nazi flags everywhere, we'd all look at that sideways too. You know, so to me, it's a welcomed first step. I'm proud of all these young people who've been out here protesting, who've been sending this message that they will not stand for this, and tearing down these statues, whether it's Robert E. Lee and any other members of the Confederacy, or it's George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. I think that it's an important first step.
Absolutely. What about you, Kellan? Thank you for that, Eric. Definitely agree with you.
Yeah, I just want to touch on, I just think Generation Z is, I mean, they have protesting down. I mean, they're lit. I thought I was going to write them off, you know, for a long time, but during this whole movement, I mean, Generation Z is out there on the front line.
Damn, that's the end of the alphabet.
And
what comes after that?
Millennials are there too, but I'm just saying, but the Generation Z, they're committed to this stuff, and I just want to give them a shout out because I was giving them, you know, some tell about it. So I just want to make that comment.
Yeah.
I love the idea and the acts of tearing down these statues. One thing though that I do have pause on is that one thing that disturbs me the most about prejudice and racism is that when it goes like under the table, when they smile in your face, but you know they're underhanded or doing something that's, you know, not in the best interests of Black folks or people of color, but particularly Black folks with these statutes in the down south. But and so me personally, I like markers. Let me know what I'm dealing with. So if I go to a certain town, you know, and I see the flags and I see, you know, like, no,
it's like a red flag for you to help you. Yeah.
I appreciate it. I'm like, okay, well, I know who I'm dealing with. And so I won't mess with you guys. You don't mess with me. And I'm not going to, you know, spend money at your restaurant. Like put those flags up so I know not to put no money in your pockets.
Yeah.
Not to, you know, because sometimes what hurt Black folks the most are the individuals who don't like you but smile in your face. So if it was a true response behind the actual populace of those towns and they actually had a huge change of heart of how they see Black people, if they all are chanting Black Lives Matter, which we know that they're not, and just mainly being quiet in these certain locales, you know, I don't know. I still like the act. I love seeing those statues topple over and being, you know, defaced or whatnot. But, you know, I'm always, you know, I like the indicators. I like the markers to know who I'm dealing with personally. So if the change has not necessarily resonated within that entire community, then I think they're, you know, it's easier for them to create policies and maintain policies because you think, oh, we're over it, but really they're still doing the exact same things when it comes to the policies that are damaging to Black lives.
Yeah. So we're about, you know, a few days short of 30 days since George Floyd. What is your assessment thus far and what's happened throughout our country right now? Do you feel that it's more of the same? When we have a long history of fighting this fight in the civil rights movement. You know, there was a time when we passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, and here we are fighting for the same thing all over again. Do you feel that there is a change this time, that there is momentum, you know, to push us to a level that we have not achieved yet? Or are you concerned that it's more of the same that we've seen already, and that, you know, that maybe nothing will change? What are your thoughts on maybe your hope of what's to come?
You know, first of all, I have to leave you guys soon after this round of interactions, and I look forward to hearing what you guys have to say before I go. I have to be honest that I have never seen people speak so articulately about abolition, about what it means to put resources into Black communities before. I have never seen people speak so articulately about white supremacy and how to identify that within themselves.
No, that's
you know, I have very, very, very cautious optimism, but I do see a change. I do see a shift in ways that I frankly hadn't expected, in ways that makes me even question myself, like, have I turned into a pessimist? You know, do I need to evaluate my faith in humanity? But you know, I do think that there's definitely a shift happening. What gives me pause is that there have been many shifts throughout the history of the United States. Many people fighting, people putting their bodies on the line for decades, for centuries. And so what keeps me up at night is how to maintain this momentum and how to take lessons learned from the past. But again, very cautiously.
That's very helpful to hear. I appreciate that. And I know many will appreciate that as well. I think a lot of people are trying to gauge, you know, how excited to be right now, because nobody wants to be fooled or played, you know, and I think that that's a concern that I'm constantly hearing. And if you leave at any point while the other two are talking, I just want to say thank you for being on Organized Voices, our second episode here, and it's an honor to have you not only on here, but also to fight alongside everybody in the front lines with our movement. So thank you for everything that you're doing, Tifanei. Yeah, hearts and love to you. Does Eric, you want to go next, since I keep calling on Kellan, about what your thoughts on what's going on and whether you feel like it's the change that we finally need?
Yeah, you know, similar to Tifanei, I have some cautious optimism. When, you know, we've been around some of the OGs that were around, including my father, former mayor of Oakland, Elihu Harris, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, and others who have been fighting this fight for a really, really long time. We've heard the stories, but I do think that this moment is different. It feels different. You know, we're seeing different speakers being elevated. We're seeing different voices being lifted, and even some of those OGs are coming out and saying that this feels different, that this appears to be different. I know we gave a shout out to Gen Z, and those young people they're a different group of young people. We've seen them, you know, just do some really, really tremendous work over the last several weeks, and it doesn't look like they want to slow down. And because they don't want to slow down, we're seeing the results coming in, whether it's police being fired, or charges being made, or legislation passing, or discussions being had at some of the highest levels of government that we just hadn't seen to this level of depth before. So I'm also very cautiously optimistic. I also agree that we can't let off the gas, that it's a fight that will not allow us to take our foot off the gas. That the only way that we can be successful in this fight is if we continue to push, continue to voice the necessary need for complete change. I know here in Sacramento, we're having the discussions about defunding police. We're having the discussions about reallocating resources. And we're seeing that happen in some of these other cities throughout the country. We're seeing some of these cities say, hey, why are we putting all of these resources towards police? Let's move these resources to other places. And at least the discussion is starting to be had in places that I did not think I would see the city of Sacramento go in this direction. Of course, they still have a long way to go. You and Tiffany and others are on the front lines on some of these things. Very, over years and years, and you guys can speak to it better than anybody. But it just feels different. And yes, it's an election year. It's 2020. So a lot of people are very interested and involved in the political process and the election that's coming up. So that has something to do with it as well. But I just really think that a lot of young people and a lot of people who are not the quote unquote usual suspects when it comes to speaking on these issues, they're coming forward now and saying that this is wrong and this needs to change. And when white folks are out protesting and getting beat up by police and that being on
shot
video,
by police more than Black people out there. I mean, that was something crazy I never saw before in my life.
getting shot by rubber bullets. I mean, it's just on, and that visual in particular has me very cautiously optimistic and hopeful.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Thoughts, Kellan?
No, I don't really think that. I share the same beliefs as Tiffany and Eric. But yeah, just, hopefully we can keep this momentum going.
Awesome. So, there's a lot of legislation and policy discussions right now. It's a very crucial time. And there's still actions going on, protests going on. I know Tiffany just left, so I'll thank her again. But so leaving us with some tips that you guys might want to offer. I know that Tiffany and some of you mentioned that you don't want to give any criticism to how one decides to protest, but seeing the actions playing out right now, and there being a surge of young activists that are new, to this fight, and to give respect to those that have been fighting this fight. Do you have any words of wisdom or advice that you want to share with young, new activists that are just now joining this fight?
Yeah, when I used to be on the front lines a long time ago, but it wasn't that long ago. But
you're still fighting the front lines, man. You're suing the police. That's front line work.
Yeah, I'm just I'm on a different front line. So when I used to be in the streets, in grassroots organizations, getting signatures, try to get ballots on the measures and stuff like that. If you are out there, if young folks are out there and want to do the work, that's essentially what you're going to have to do. You got to keep feet on the ground, and continuously be in the face of the population, which would be considered, which King would term as the white moderate, and continuously put pressure on them to have these conversations, to think about them, to ask questions, to be more knowledgeable about the issues. And so when they go to vote for certain individuals, politicians, or vote on certain policies, they understand the ramifications of their vote, and not just vote and say, well, it doesn't affect me, so who cares? Because that's what I remember, the most when I was doing that type of work, of just continuously being in the face of people who don't come from the same backgrounds, or who may actually be on the opposite aisle of you on these issues, and just be okay with the no's, no, I don't want to be bothered right now. But I think the more you do it, the more I think the better chance that you will have of getting good results when it counts, and that means voting, essentially, because policies are created by those who are in power, and nothing changes without a policy change. So I think that would be like my main advice.
Awesome. That's good advice. What about you, Eric?
Yeah, you know, the advice that I would probably give to young people who are just getting involved would be to remain as informed as you can be. I think that, you know, and that can come from a whole bunch of different sources. It can come from speaking to elders, or it can come from talking to others your own age who are experiencing different things during these times. I think that, as Tiffany spoke earlier, you know, the level of articulation on some of these issues is at an all-time high, or at least relative to like recent times. I think you know, we discussed the Black Panthers earlier, and you know, they were as articulate and as informed and as just spot on as any generation of leaders has ever been. Shout out to, of course, Angela Davis, who's still
Just gonna
fighting
say,
that
man,
fight.
when Angela Davis shows up to a protest, you know it's real.
Right,
So I just,
right,
oh man, that warmed my heart to see that. Just made my whole
absolutely.
weekend. Yeah, for Juneteenth, no less. Man, that was so symbolic and powerful. Brought tears to my eyes.
Absolutely.
And it definitely adds a level of seriousness and respect to the work, you know, that we're doing right now. And I think young kids really need to see that. You know, there's OGs in this fight that are still here, you know, and so I hope that they see that as a sign of, you know, the need for us to, you know, give the respect of being informed about the work that's been done and what brought us to this point. So yeah, no, and maybe another resource is listening to podcasts like Organized Voices, you know, to be informed on social justice issues. I think that these conversations are, I think conversations you and I, and, you know, all of us have, you know, as friends and as colleagues in this fight, but it's not communicated enough in the mainstream media for kids and students and young people to really, to grasp. There's not really like a one, you know, one channel or source that really provides all of this, you know, insight that, you know, young activists might need. I don't know if, Eric, you spent any time in Oakland, but I know, Kellan, growing up in Oakland, do you remember the radio on KMEL, the show Street Soldiers?
Yeah.
Yeah, this podcast is actually inspired by Street Soldiers, because every Sunday night when I was growing up, I would, you know, tune in with my little Walkman and have all the lights off. My parents would make me go to sleep early, and I would just listen to Street Soldiers, and it'd be people calling in about, you know, street injustice, you know, and the hosts would, you know, have these deep conversations that would just go on, you know, music paused and just have some serious conversations. And I really appreciated having that. And I know it's not in existence now, but that's why I kind of wanted to revive that kind of theme for people to have a resource so that they can hear from our OGs and our activists and our civil rights attorneys to provide this information so that we can get it out. And I know Sean King is one source, and there's several others that are in this game that, you know, are trying to disseminate that information, but there's never too much of, you know, having channels available, platforms available, you know, for kids to get this information. So moving forward, what are some steps, not just for kids, but for parents, adults, families, you know, in, you know, moving, because another big question that I always get is, what can we do? You know, how can we help? And, you know, sometimes I'm not able to really identify exactly how, but there are many ways. What are maybe your top 3 ways that people can get involved in helping Black liberation specifically?
Well, I would say voting. I know I got a lot of friends all over the spectrum on this issue. But, you know, it's, you know, the rhetoric is that, you know, there's this systemic oppression that is so pervasive that is preventing Black, you know, people from getting to a point where we share in the benefits of this country.
Right.
And I'm of the mindset, and I don't totally disagree with folks on the other aisle of this, but I'm of the mindset is that we have to use all tools available to us in order to move forward and progress forward. And so, I think specifically Black folks, but everybody who's online with Black Lives Matter and the issues that are presented should get out there and vote. And put a lot of pressure on the politicians to, have the same agenda that we do. So that's one thing for me. A second thing is to continue the conversations, the hard conversations with people that you probably know who are on the fringe. And I have certain colleagues that we're going to law school. Everybody doesn't think the same way as me, and but just having those conversations with those individuals to see if you can move the needle a little bit. And so so that's the second one. A third would be I don't know. I think a third would be to essentially, what's the word I'm looking for? To encourage and to support. That's the word I'm looking for.
Yeah.
Support those who are doing the work.
Yeah.
Because, being out there like yourself, like, I don't know how you have a life, Liz, but,
Life. I
but
don't.
to support people with everything that you can, if it's finances that you can use to support a cause, if it's your time, if it's, a skill that you have, if it's, if you're just support people who are in the fight, so that's the third one.
Thank you for that. No, those are helpful pieces of advice. And I just want to say that I really appreciate the perspective. The more we have, the better, because again, this is organized voices. It's specifically named that so that we can get all the voices involved. And I don't want to be the only person advocating for specific strategies. The more the better. And different things work for different people. And so I think that that's very valuable that you offer those insights. What about you, Eric? Do you have any top 3 tips for how to further this movement for all of us as a community and as a nation?
Right. I think that Kellan's 3 points were really, really good. I have one, I think it's overlooked often. And I would say don't underestimate the individual conversations that you can have with other people. At the organization that I work with, we had, an organization-wide discussion about things that the organization can do better to, have a better connection with the Black community, whether it's reach out to the NAACP or Black Lives Matter or fraternities and sororities, etc. But something that I think a lot of people kind of forget about, because they often want to kind of do the big thing, is simply having conversations with people that matter to you. Not being afraid to have sometimes uncomfortable conversations, but to have them, especially with people who don't always align with your way of thinking, because otherwise we get into silos, we get reinforcement, which is great, and encouragement, which is great. But sometimes it is important that we have some of these conversations with folks who don't always align with exactly what we're doing, and not being afraid to call people out, not being afraid to, when we're having a discussion with somebody who is not racist but not anti-racist, explaining to them the difference between what it is to be an anti-racist and non-racist, and explaining the importance of having anti-racists in our communities, anti-racists at the highest levels of government, and policy decision making, and really getting to the nitty gritty when it comes to understanding how powerful it is when we have a community and a society of anti-racists. So I'd say that that is probably the one thing that I often don't hear, folks bring up too often, but I think that it's something that we should always keep in mind.
Yeah, and just quickly to also expand that on kind of normalizing this movement in our culture, right? Like just not too long ago, we were ostracizing Colin Kaepernick, for taking a knee. And now there's a shift in him being awarded the highest, honor by Amnesty, International, and to commend him now. There's a lot of people who are now changing their minds about how they felt about Kaepernick. But that just being one example, do you see the way that our culture might be shifted in normalizing this movement right now, and in what ways, maybe in the entertainment or in sports, do you want to see, or would you be supportive of seeing, the support for this movement, or do you think that that's not the right place, or doesn't have a place in those arenas to address this issue?
I think it's interesting. I am still raving about Dave Chappelle's special from last week, 846, on YouTube, where he has a kind of a similar discussion about whether celebrities need to be saying something on these issues. And I think that there is a time and place for it. I think that this movement at this time has been great in terms of having the right leaders saying the right things and in the right spaces. But I also think that it's important that everybody in our communities and in our societies recognize these issues appear all over the place. So whether it's the lack, whether it's the lack of Black journalists, the lack of Black reporting, and we can go on and on about spaces where there needs to be more Black voices and more intersectional voices. We talked earlier about the intersectionality of race and disability, but also race and gender. There needs to be more Black females in positions of authority, in positions where they can speak their truths and express their experiences. Also, just different forms of intersectionality that need to be lifted, because it's one thing to experience something as an African American male on some of these platforms and in some of these spaces, but then to also recognize that as Black men, we have certain privileges that Black women do not experience, and that it's important that sometimes Black men take a step back and encourage Black women to take step forwards in some of the spaces that they're in. So to kind of answer, so to go back and answering your question, I do think that it is important that people in some of these spaces let their voices be heard. I'm glad that they haven't been kind of front and center on this particular issue at this particular moment. But I do think that there is a time and space for it, because when our voices are all united and in alignment with each other, it's even more powerful, and hopefully, their encouragement and support in these issues across the board can lift these issues to the places that they need to be lifted to, and we can see some of the changes that we need to see.
Absolutely. Like Beyonce is writing a letter to to Breonna Taylor's case about wanting those officers charged. I mean, that's her using her influence in a way that she doesn't have to do that. Oh, granted, the Carters have been, hiring attorneys to defend the families of those that were victimized by police brutality. So they are using their platform. But Dave Chappelle made that point that, the streets are speaking for themselves. There's a space and a level of respect that he gives to that. So I definitely see a lot of different opinions on this. And so thank you for that perspective. Kellan, what are your thoughts? And especially because, you also do entertainment law as well. And so I just wanted to kind of get your perspective on what your thoughts are on the platforms of entertainers and the culture and speaking out on this.
I'm never against anyone using their platform to, speak truth. And I understand Dave Chappelle's point in regards to, people in the public are always looking to an entertainer to give them advice about some real issues. And, I remember when he did that San Francisco stand up? And he was like, let's call Ja Rule, see what he has to say about it. That was one of the funniest jokes that I've heard because really, who gives a F what Ja Rule has to say? I'm not looking for Ja Rule to give me advice in this situation. However, but we do see that this country loves celebrities and are influenced by celebrities. I had a class at Cal back in undergrad, and it was about the revolution and the cultural side of the revolution, and there was a lot to do with Americans supposedly not liking this idea of having a royal family. And in the class, we tried to look into that a little bit more deeply. And, one of the points of the class was to at least make the argument that Americans are highly influenced by people that they would suggest or believe are royalty and are influenced by them.
Yeah.
And so we love that, and we will move accordingly if Beyonce and if these other diamond list celebrities, like Beyonce, she's like on a whole nother level, but not just the A-list celebrities, but these diamond list celebrities and say, hey, we need to move, and these certain injustices keep occurring in our society, and they should no longer happen. I'm all on board with that because most people believe that to be gospel. So, how they, listen to these celebrities, and I do agree with Dave Chappelle. Sometimes we want the folks who are most knowledgeable and most articulate about the subject to speak, and sometimes that is the streets saying this is how we need to move. But I can't deny the fact of Americans love their royalty, and they will move when they are asked to do so by those in power. So like when I heard when Taylor Swift came out with something, I was like, hell yeah, Taylor Swift say something, because we know a lot of her listeners are have a different viewpoint, or like Eric said, are likely they're not racist, but they're not racist. So hopefully, and I haven't really followed Taylor Swift. I'm not a huge Taylor Swift fan or anything like that, so I don't know exactly what she's been saying after her one comment. But I generally think it's a good thing.
Yeah, no, it's funny how. Yeah, go ahead.
Just a real quick, Kellan mentioned Taylor Swift, and I also just wanted to say that it's really important for white celebrities to say something.
Right.
I mean, so often we hear from the Beyoncés or Jay-Z's or LeBron Jameses, which is a wonderful thing. And as you said, they're the diamond list, top notch. It's great to hear them say it. But when we're able to get a Taylor Swift or some of these other white celebrities saying what we've been saying for generations and generations, when we're able to get some of them to say it, and when they really are speaking from their hearts, and they're able to show through actions what they're doing to make change happen, I think that that's a wonderful thing too.
Imagine if Tom Brady took a knee, man. You know, hey, that would change the game.
Right.
Hashtag Tom Brady, we're calling you out. We need your help. And I just want to mention, you know, it's funny that Dave Chappelle said what he said about, you know, letting the streets speak for themselves. And at the same time, he still did the special, right? Calling attention to it. So he was giving respect, but at the same time, still showing the support that Don Lemon was calling him out to give. And so I thought that goes to show that both can happen. You know, you can give credence to the streets and let them speak for themselves about what needs to change and what needs to move. But celebrities and people with platforms can still support that. And it goes back to your tips about how we can support the movement, is being supportive and being vocal, and showing your solidarity in the many ways that we can. And so summarizing all of what we've talked about, I think there's various ways that people can support this. It really is a matter of, you know, human rights. Jada Pinkett Smith just, you know, released her statement about how this is, you know, a discussion that invokes fire, you know, and if you don't want the fire, you can't be in this fight. And that's absolutely true. But, you know, there are different ways for people to communicate their support and their solidarity in this movement, as long as you're making clear what side you're on, because it's really one or the other. You know, are you for racism or are you against racism? And it really should be that simple. But what are your thoughts on that? Do you think it's a simple matter of being against racism, or do you think it's more complicated than that?
Well, it all depends on the lens you're looking at, and
Right. I mean,
I think it's that simple.
Right?
Either you're for racism or
what
against
are you
it.
risking?
However, I do realize that, certain individuals just have a certain history, a certain experience that it's not necessarily their fault. I was grown up and I was not exposed to certain ideas and ways of thinking and ways of living. And it was only when, someone told me like, hey, maybe you should stretch your thinking a little bit more, then I was able to do so. But you still have a lot of pockets in America where there's no one that's going to stretch somebody's thinking, somebody's perception of how they view the world. And I think, having that articulate conversation with that individual is a necessity to get them to see that there are problems bigger than what you once believed. And sometimes these individuals are just not exposed to anyone that can open their eyes to that. And so is it just as simple as, are you for racism or you are against it? Maybe not. In my eyes, yeah. But I think there's a lot of individuals who just need the right exposure to the conversation. And then it's a working process, because like I said, I had certain ideas that were not, conducive to allow individuals to be the best versions of themselves. And it was just having a conversation, being taught, being willing to listen, and being and having an open mind where I was able to understand, but that wasn't an overnight process. And so I think it's a little bit more complicated than just, hey, are you for racism or against racism? You kind of maybe take some layers off and then get into the nitty gritty of, what's actually motivating people. Because sometimes what's actually motivating people is they're just trying to do the best that they can for what they know.
Yeah.
And so you just got to understand that for certain individuals, there's certain people, that has an agenda and they're rolling with it. But there's a good enough handful of people who are just doing the best that they can with what they know.
Good point. What about you, Eric? Is it simple?
Yeah.
Should be simple?
I don't think it's that simple. We talked earlier about the systems, and whether it's the education system, the criminal justice system, the financial system, the political system, these systems were built on racism. And they've been racist from the beginning in this country. And so it's not and then we go into different industries, the film industries, the music industry, and on and on. And there's racism embedded deep in all of these things. And so there are a lot of situations where people might just not know, one way or the other. And as Kellan said, there are parts of this country. I played wheelchair basketball. Still play it every now and then, but I played wheelchair basketball in high school and in college. We traveled to parts of the country I would have never thought I would ever go to, whether it's parts of Western Pennsylvania, parts of, rural parts of Oklahoma and Wisconsin, rural parts of the South that I would not have, had any reason to go to. And there are just places where people do not have the same level of exposure and experience. But at the same time, we as justice fighters, we should not allow that to be an excuse, in my opinion. We're expected. I heard a quote earlier from somebody saying that, as people of color, we're expected to understand white culture if we graduate with a GED. White people have to have a PhD at levels of race and gender and culture to be able to understand some of the even a portion of some of the experiences that we've gone through over the years and throughout the centuries. So I think that there's a huge kind of imbalance when it comes to the level of knowledge and experience that we might have of white culture and that they might have of our culture. But in these times with the level of technology, we've talked about education and what young people kind of are expected to know. Young people are able to find information in a matter of seconds and matter of minutes if you give them kind of the right parameters and the right motivation. If it's something that matters to you, and equality and justice should matter to people, they'll find the information. They'll make sure that they're doing what's necessary to act correctly and to be anti-racist. We talked a little bit about Colin Kaepernick and all these folks coming now, all these teams now, whether it's the 49ers themselves or other teams who are all about Black Lives Matter. Drew Brees saying that he now understands what's up with kneeling during the national anthem. And it's like, y'all have had however many years since Colin started kneeling. And that was 4 years ago, where you could have asked, where you could have reached out, you could have done some reading of some Black authors who've gone in depth on these issues. But when something's a priority for you, when something really is important to you, you'll go above and beyond and do that extra research. So it is a little bit more complicated than just, than that. But I think that, when it's a priority, they'll go above and beyond.
Right. Yeah, so we're coming up on a few more minutes left of the podcast, but I just really want to thank you both for giving us such invaluable insight. This is very important, information that needs to be shared. A lot of people are at a time right now where, because of the momentum and because of the real changes that I think all of us are really hopeful that this will, continue to be, it's important to have the perspectives, the correct ones, from people that are qualified to speak on it. And so that's why I think that it's important to have these conversations and further them. But because this is a Father's Day special, I wanted to end the podcast with maybe hearing from each of you your favorite memory of your father. I know that's like kind of putting you on the spot without a lot of preparation, but whatever memory that pops up in your head that you want to share that, honors your father, like a funny story or a little memory that you have of your father that just pops to mind, we'd love to hear it. And I'm sure they would love to hear it when they hear this.
It's funny. I'll go first, so the father on here can finish us off. But I am really really fortunate. I was blessed to have a dad who's not only been there and been active, but has been a real guiding light for me, a North Star for me. And I'll say this little kind of funny story. My dad went to UC Berkeley as well, for law school, and when I was in, I think it was middle school, I brought home a report card that was not up to snuff, I would say.
Did you get like an A minus or a B plus or something?
I don't even want to repeat it. I don't want you to have a negative view of me. But I brought it home, and I was afraid and whatever else. And my dad, he was like, with grades like these, you'll never be able to go to Harvard. You'll never be able to go to Stanford or Cal or UCLA or whatever. And it was funny because I responded by saying I didn't want to go to those schools anyways. And it was a really cool moment for us because up until that time, it was excellence is kind of, Black excellence is where our family goals are. And that included, high performance in school, with the goals and aspirations of getting to the best colleges you can go to. But it was a cool moment for us because we were able to, he didn't get upset when I said that. He didn't try to force down my throat that it's important to go to those schools because that's the only way to be successful or anything like that. And he, from, just that point and beyond, it was like, Eric's his own person. Eric's going to make the best decision for him. And I'm going to be there to support him. Yeah. And, for me, that meant going to school to play wheelchair basketball, which led me down a path that I will never regret and never, feel sorry about or anything like that. I love the fact that I was able to play wheelchair basketball in college, and the experiences that I was able to get in Washington, D.C., advocating for people with disabilities at the Democratic National Convention in 2012, and so many different other experiences that I was able to have because of the path that I was on. And so, that was just a really cool moment for us, and kind of a turning point in the relationship that I had with my dad, and him kind of respecting me and acknowledging me as an individual who might go down a different path than he might have chosen, but still my own, and he supported me all the way through and still does.
That's beautiful. I just want to quickly say, I saw your dad's interview with Scott Syfax on Studio Sacramento, and it touched me that he couldn't sing you enough praises, you and Martin. He said, the thing I'm most proud of my boys, my sons, is that both of them are good people, that they have integrity and that they care about being good people. And when I heard that, I was very emotional just seeing that, because you know how much I revere your father and your mother, Mama Mills. Shout out to Mama Mills, and your brother Martin. I love your whole family. But to hear that being the priority for him as a father was just very touching and very inspirational, and I hope that other fathers take suit. So thank you for sharing that special Father's Day story. Kellan, what's the story that you want to share about your father? Can't wait to hear that.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to go in a different direction, mainly because of being a parent. I see myself doing the exact same thing. Mm-hmm. And I didn't really appreciate it when I was a kid, but I appreciate it now as an adult. Yeah. But one thing that my father did that I appreciate now more so than ever was to, essentially show me a work ethic. And I love what Eric said about Black excellence. I have a friend who's in a band. It's called the Black Excellence Band.
Awesome. I'm gonna look that band up.
Shout out Clean and everybody in the Black Excellence Band. But my father would, you know, I was you know, athlete, you know, and it was a lot, you know, training and all the little things, mowing the grass and all this type of stuff. I don't, washing cars, all these little things that just get on my nerves when I was little. But you know, looking back at it, it was this huge life lesson that has benefited greatly, and to get me to the point where I am. So you know, I got funny stories, but I just really wanted to point that out, is that you know some of the things that dads get a bad rep for, and you know, they're not the friends of the kids, and mom is generally is, and so I, you know, if I wanted to give my dad a shout out, was just to let him know that I definitely appreciate him showing me that a work ethic is a good thing. It's a priceless thing, especially, you know, in order to move the Black family forward. It's a lot for a Black man. You know, you know, be under attack, and the same thing for a Black woman. I already know, you know, my wife could probably say the exact same thing about her mother, but and her father as well. But I just want to point that out. But I do want to have a funny story.
That's right.
I do want to say. So it was when I was playing basketball. You know, my father was known to like be the one that's not in the stands, right? So
Who
he'd
was
be the one that's like either on the field, on the
Yeah.
baseball diamond, the coaching box, you know.
Oh man.
And one thing that we crack up about is that, you know, I'm shooting some free throws, and I literally look to the left, and it's like crunch time free throws, and my dad is like on the sideline next to the referee. I just gotta take my hat off to him, because how much guts that takes, you know, to be like in a real game and be on the sideline standing next to the referee and encouraging your son to, you know, take his time and to take a deep breath and to follow through with your shot. You know, he held up the post too, you know, just like we practiced. That's being all in for the, you know, he never like beat up a referee or coach or anything. I'm not saying he's one of those. But because, you know, at that point in time, I was at you know, it was the playoffs and the crowd was against me. And the fact that he got on to the floor and was in my visual to kind of calm me down and to motivate me to do as best as I could. I just think that's priceless, because, you know, that's what black fathers do. They put themselves in a situation where they allow their kids to know that I'm going to be on your side and with you in the trenches no matter what. So.
Yeah, awesome. I love it.
But it was still funny seeing them there.
Yeah, no, I could just visualize that thing, and it's hilarious. I just want to quickly shout out to my dad. Mine's short, but my dad and I have butted heads all my life. I left home at 16 because I couldn't stand his nagging, and among other things. But one thing that I've, as I matured and grew older, learned to appreciate is, you know, getting on my helmet about, you know, wanting me to be the best version of me, and not raising me to be a girly girl. He's raised me with a lot of tough love, and I don't think today I could do any of the work that I'm doing right now if he had raised me to be a delicate flower. And so that's something that I think I resented for a lot of my adolescent years. But me being 35 years old now and doing this work, he definitely prepared me for the world in terms of being tough and resilient, and being prepared for all the wolves out here to battle, because you can't fight these wolves being a little lamb. So I do want to thank my father for that. He definitely taught me how to be tough. So shout out to my father for teaching me how to be strong. So that concludes our second episode of Organized Voices. Thank you so much for being a voice to our people. Your knowledge, your wisdom, your experiences really help us, you know, in the community for the insight and your advice. So thank you for joining us on this episode, and I will definitely be posting it on all of our platforms, Spotify, Apple, rapstation.com. Shout outs again to Chuck D, Krista, Monique for having us on. And it'll also be on YouTube and my IG, Still Busy Lizzie, as well. And I look forward to seeing you out there in the front lines. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.